Radio Espial is a series of podcasts brought to you across the internet by TIPM Media. Presented by investigative journalist Mick Rooney, it covers a host of topics from international media, publishing, aviation, and technology. Thank you for listening to this podcast today.
Here we go for episode 5 of Radio Spall. And today we're talking publishing, self-publishing, printing and technology. We've a great guest for you coming up. I'll talk to you in just a second. Okay, we took a lengthy break over the summer. We're back now into the autumn, and I know from people in the northern hemisphere we're going into autumn. People from the southern hemisphere, good luck to you, you're going into your summer. Today we will be talking, as I say, publishing, self-publishing, printing and technology, and we have a great guest in Kevin Spall, who is the CEO and president of Thomson-Shore, and we'll be talking to him very, very shortly.
Radio Espial is a series of podcasts brought to you across the internet by TIPM Media. Presented by investigative journalist Mick Rooney, it covers a host of topics from international media, publishing, aviation, and technology. Thank you for listening to this podcast today.
Okay, very shortly we'll be joined by Kevin Spall, who is the CEO and president, not the president, perhaps a discussion for another day. He's the president of Thomson-Shore. Let me tell you a little bit about Thomson-Shore just before we talk to Kevin. Thomson-Shore was founded in 1972. It's located in Dexter, Michigan, USA. Thomson-Shore has 100% employee-owned ownership. It's a full-service book manufacturing, printing, publishing, production and distribution company. The company specialises in fulfilling the needs of book publishers and authors, from author's initial Word document to the end reader. Their business solutions span the entire publishing supply chain. Publishers of all types and sizes, that's authors, self-publishers, independent publishers, trade publishers, religious organisations and universities benefit from their services, which is short to medium run digital and offset book publishing. That includes case and perfect binding, layout and design, editorial reviews, ISBN acquisition, ebook conversion, marketing of your book, full service distribution and fulfillment. Really, this is, I suppose, a continuation of the themes that we've been discussing in the previous two episodes with Linda and Mark. So, look, as always, the best thing to do is let's go straight to Kevin and talk to him. Okay, welcome back, Radio Espial, and I'm delighted that Kevin Spall has joined us from Thomson-Shore. We're going to be discussing publishing, self-publishing, printing, and various technologies around that. Kevin, I'm delighted you could join us.
Thank you, Mick. I'm honored and very pleased to be on with you. Thank you.
It's great to have you. I suppose where I start with all of our guests in every episode is more a sort of slow introduction to the person, because people, straight away are asking now, who's Kevin, what's Thomson-Shore. Obviously, I've already spoken about the business of Thomson-Shore. So maybe to start with, let's concentrate on a little bit about you. Your first of all, where are you from? You're from Michigan?
I'm not. I grew up in upstate New York, outside of Rochester, relatively small suburb of a relatively large city, probably about 5 or 6 hours outside of New York, north of New York City. Grew up there and moved on from Rochester and went into college around the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania. So that's my roots, but I've popped around the East Coast from Manhattan to Cleveland and now residing outside of Detroit in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Excellent. Okay, let's move on a little bit. That was your growing up. And I suppose we all move into the area of your career. What got you into this business? Is this where you started out?
It's an interesting path, I guess. I never intended to end up on the publishing, print distribution side of the industry. When I grew up, I really grew up out of the art of my life at that time. So I was a constant drawing, painting. I always say that I spent most of my free hours copying album covers from the Moody Blues and the Doors and Sgt. Pepper's all through the 70s and 80s. So I went into art school and went into a Bachelor of Fine Arts in graphic design. And upon graduation, couldn't find a job in design and went into the printing business. Actually, my grandfather was a print sales rep for a company in New York. And, it's in the blood. I didn't know that until that time, which is funny. After I had decided to go into printing, I found out my grandfather had been printing for 40 years. I just never had that conversation with him. So it was pretty neat how that lined up. So I came in through the kind of the craft side, the art side, and then moved into technology. So early on in my career is when, in fact, I was just talking to my daughter last night. I was working in programs like Ready, Set, Go and PageMaker and early versions of Quark Express, and then, of course, InDesign, which my daughter's learning now in terms of laying out laying out books. So I had the pleasure and the experience of desktop publishing coming to the world in the 90s and moving so quickly. So I got caught up in all that technology on the print side and loved it, and that moved me on in my career, and just have always loved the print side. And then, of course, as time went on, we got more into the publishing side, and the two kind of have melded from the Thomson-Shore perspective.
When you talk about that sort of more art-based side, when you went to college, as you were growing up, did the writing bug ever bite? Did you ever consider going into that area?
I didn't. And I'm embarrassed to say I didn't even read that much at the time. I was so busy living life and painting. So I didn't consider.
So visual art was more of an aspect where you were coming from when you were younger.
Absolutely. Primarily drawing, painting, and then as I went into college, I got into sculpture. And it was really the physical art that I was most passionate about, and that to a great extent influences my role today.
What you do now, exactly, yeah.
Absolutely, we put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the way the book looks and feels and smells and all those things that I believe have an emotional reaction to the reader. So it's I think those early days really have helped form our approach to the indie market at Thomson-Shore, no question. As I moved through my career progression, my early years in printing were all around the general commercial market, very high-end printing for Cadillac and Mercedes, and that's where I learned the art of printing, the high-quality art of printing. And then I went to work for Donnelly and got exposed to books in New York City and working with publishers in the early 2000s. And that's kind of what lit the fire of publishing and literature in me at that time.
We're going to talk a little bit about Thomson-Shore very shortly. But in a more broader general sense, I just want to, without getting too much into the Thomson-Shore story, which, as I say, we're going to talk about very shortly, but just your general views on the industry and the history and the rise of self-publishing today as it was previously.
Sure. I moved into the publishing print side of the industry, as I said, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that was when self-publishing was still very, very small percentage. There wasn't a lot of it happening. There were some, certainly, ways to get your book self-published, but at the time it was pretty traditional model of publishing. And it was booming at that time in the 90s and early 2000s. The publishing market was strong. There were record years for printed book matter, and I think when things really started to change in terms of people thinking of new models, as I recall, it was when Stephen King brought out his first ebook, the Silver Bullet, I think, was something of that nature, and then people started thinking about this new kind of direct-to-reader model. Is that certainly in ebooks that was happening, and that's when people started to play around with it on the print side, and really it was Ingram and Lightning Source that started that in terms of full scale. And I was fortunate enough at after my time in New York to go work with the folks at Ingram early on in the mid 2000s, and Lightning Source, and that's when things really started to take off. The process worked in terms of an author to reader workflow, and it was repeatable, and it was becoming a viable, actually very strategic model for new authors and small publishers and some large publishers in terms of their deep backlist. So I think it was the creation of the digital print and the distribution coming together in the mid 2000s where that self-publishing model really started to take off, and then once it did, of course, it blew up from there and continues to.
I suppose one of the major lines of definition that when I talk to authors, when I talk to publishers, publishing services, is I suppose not all printers, publishers, self-publishing service providers, are created equal, and that's something we've learned throughout this industry, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about a case study of that later on in this interview. But just as we move now to Thomson-Shore, tell me a little bit about the history of Thomson-Shore, because you guys have been around a long time.
We have. The company started in 1972. Ned Thompson and Harry Shore. And Ned and Harry founded the company primarily to service the university press market. And I think the reason why that's so relevant is even back then, that was kind of considered the short run print market and the very high quality standards for university presses. So we started kind of with that expectation, working in small batch, very high quality, very high service. All through the 70s, the company grew. In the 80s, we began to get into more trade type publishing and religious publishers. Continued to grow, and through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, really the height of the growth for the company was in 2008, just before the recession, where we were hitting our highest revenue. The most customers at that time we had worked with which was in the thousands, and always kind of specialized with high quality product, high quality service, always in the print only realm. Mm-hmm. So we really we were working directly with authors then, all through the 70s and 80s, but we didn't call it self-publishing. It was called vanity publishing at the time, and it was really more about authors who had completed project and they were bringing it to us to print. We weren't involved in any of the upfront publishing service. And that really happened post-recession, when we woke up with everyone else in the world and tried to figure out what we were going to do.
This would have been around sort of 2006 to 2008 when things really started to get difficult.
Yeah, I would say really 2008, of course, is when it really hit home hard. We lost about 20% of our top line sales, along with most printing companies in the States. And that lasted through 2009. And we had to decide what we wanted to do to not just kind of get our revenue stabilized, but we at the same time were looking at this industry that was going through this tremendous transformation. Ebooks just came out, and then of course self-publishing was beginning to boom. At this time there were hundreds of thousands of titles per year in the States that were being published directly from authors. That number now is about 1 million a year. So the industry at large was changing, and we recognized that. So that's when we started to think about taking publishing services more seriously, and then later adding the distribution services along with the complement of our print platform. And I think that, not to jump forward in the conversation, but right now, one of the things I think is a unique tool in self-publishing in terms of a successful title is relying on both digital print and offset print.
Yeah, that's an important factor, isn't it? Because an awful lot of self-published authors don't realize that. Because I always say to an author, okay, they've done the manuscript, they've done their research, they've whether they've gone to the independent publishing magazine, they've went to Alloy, they've got the whole picture. They make their choice as to how they want to do this, how much involvement they have to give, on the more technical and design aspects. They pretty quickly realised that a marketing plan is fundamental, and long before the book is ever available. Just talk to me a little bit about how that's because that sort of moved us on from the vanity aspect of, as you mentioned now, the digital short runs and litho. And just for our listeners, obviously there was a time in the industry prior to what we call digital printing, and when we talk about digital printing, we're not talking necessarily about ebooks. We're talking about a process of technology that's come along that allows guys like you, people like Lightning Source, the whole Ingram program, to essentially supply books one at a time on demand, rather than the old style, the way publishers used to work, where it's like, okay, we've got Joe Bloggs with a new book. He's not Stephen King, so we are not going to do 500,000 or 1 million first print run. Maybe we only project sales-wise that at best, in the first 6 to 12 months, they might sell 5,000 books. But of course, we've moved on now with digital short run technology, because it allows an author to sell, one copy at a time on demand. There isn't necessarily, if not required, a warehouse that has several hundred or several thousand books. But going back to this point I made at the start of this, which is really important now for marketing, authors, they love this idea of the whole print-on-demand technology the development of it over the last 20 years. But fundamentally, authors' marketing still needs to adopt some of the traditional methods of marketing. So I'd say to an author who comes to me, okay, that's great, you've got your book set up, now your marketing plan, but look, if you're going to go to a bookstore, if you're going to hold a physical event somewhere, you still need physical books. You can't market without physical books. You still need physical books to send to reviewers, to send to influencers. So just talk to me a little bit about what you've discovered from your position with Thomson-Shore all around that.
Well, I absolutely agree with just about all the points you made. I do agree entirely that digital print, short run, and or print on demand is really allowed this whole new segment of the industry to not only be viable, but to flourish. Where I see authors being most successful is when they're in the stage, even some who are still writing, but certainly when you're getting into editorial and beginning to work your marketing plan, which I believe is the most important tool for a successful book launch and successful book sales. As you're developing that marketing tool, the natural question, as you said, Mick, is to say, okay, how many of these books do I think I'm going to sell? Is this a memoir that only my friends and family are going to buy and it's 100 copies? Or is this a memoir that also has a professional aspect to it that perhaps engineers will also be interested in, that might sell 2,000 copies? That decision alone
and understanding that, yeah.
That understanding that and talking it out with your editor, your book coach, that decision alone can send you in the direction of digital print on demand, or an offset run of 1,000 or 1,500. And the reason why I think that's so important is the price point between printing that book on print on demand might be $3.50 or $4.
There's a significant cutting point, isn't there? And it's come down. At one stage, I think the cut-off point was, it could have been 5,000 copies, 2,000 copies. It's a lot less than that now. I think there's a core. I think the last time I sort of analysed this industry was, I felt it was maybe in and around the 800 mark of a run.
I would agree.
It might even have dropped from that now.
I think for paperback books, softcover books, we typically see the mark a little bit lower than 800, but not much, maybe 600 or 700. For case-bound books, hardcover books, that crossover point is probably closer to 200 or 300. Yeah. So I think having that upfront discussion can influence what path you take from a printing standpoint. That said, optimal to be able to take advantage of both. We published and printed a book called Black Man in the White House, where I really think that publisher utilized the best of digital printing and the best of offset printing to meet the demand and gain the most financial benefit.
Exactly. It's not an either or.
Absolutely.
This goes back to so many times I have to, say to an author, look, the business has developed with so many print opportunities, marketing opportunities. Nothing is an either or. You can complement so many things together.
I think using digital print, whether it be print on demand or ultra short run, to do advanced reader copies for reviews, to do that initial launch of 100 or 200 copies, get that into the market, start to satisfy demand. And if you see that demand growing to the extent that you had expected, or it may even be a surprise, to take that and shoot that over onto a litho offset platform, that's an ideal scenario. And then when the book starts to slow down, you go back over to digital print. It should really, all of that should be in the picture of a successful production for a book.
Planning process. Just let's talk a little bit more about Thomson-Shore. One of the things I was fascinated with in regards its history, and you haven't spoken about it up till now, but I want you to talk a little bit as to what was going on at the time. I suppose essentially, am I right that Thomson-Shore started as kind of like a family-owned business initially, like many businesses expanded, but ultimately something significant happened, and I feel this is reflective, perhaps, of a lot of businesses in America that look at this model of employer ownership, much more employer involvement, and in a more general sense of business in the United States now. Can you just talk to me a little bit about how that came about with Thomson-Shore?
Sure. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It started as a privately held, family-owned, if you will, with Ned and Harry, and they grew it like that through the 70s, 80s, and they ran the company very much as a family-owned company. The culture was very inclusive. Everything from having lunch with employees every day to picnics on any various weekends. And when Ned and Harry were preparing to retire, they were considering their options. They could have sold the company to any number of printing companies, whether that be Donnelly or Quad or any number at the time. But they didn't want that. They wanted it to remain kind of that family culture.
Sure. Yeah.
So they did the work, and at this time, this was in the mid '80s. They decided to sell the company to the employees, and that was something relatively new at that time. And they did that in the mid '80s. The employees, over a period of time, up until actually the recession, the height of the recession, ironically enough, is when the company went 100% employee owned, and has been since. But as a result, there's, as you said, incredible engagement from employees. Everyone really cares about what we're doing here at the company. And where most people see it is when you come in for a tour, the employees are really very engaging with customers and prospective customers. Everyone takes a lot of pride in what they do here.
It's something more and more that I'm seeing companies, but this was something, and I don't know when you started the sort of let's call it the factory tour, the manufacturing tour for be it bigger clients, be it just assembling some authors together. This was something that I noted, and maybe it's the case in the US, but I noted it more in the UK. That more, companies like CPI, Anthony Rowe, Troubadour, Matador, we're getting more into that, in having open days where they invite authors in to say, look, here's the machines, this is the process, here's how we do it. And these were obviously companies that were getting more and more into publishing services beyond just the idea of print, getting into areas of whether it was distribution, channels, marketing. And I think it's an amazing thing that so many companies have sort of figured that out, that the importance of the one-on-one aspect, or having a group tour within their, so just talk to us a little bit, because like I said, you've been doing that for quite a while now.
Yeah, yeah. I think the one of the hardest things that an author has to contend with if they decide they want to self-publish is just knowing what to do and where to go, and there are so many false starts in terms of information available on the web, and what I often call pop-up publishers that are willing to take authors' money. So an author has to kind of cut through all that junk, and often they get routed down a bad path. So having an opportunity to talk one-on-one with an author or a group of authors to explain to them the process and how it works, really under one roof, everything from how the design and editorial stage happens or could happen, through this discussion we had about digital print versus offset print, and then distribution, of course, which is a huge issue, marketing. Having that opportunity to explain one-on-one and in kind of an intimate manner is incredibly beneficial to the author, and I think obviously it gives us a chance to show authors why a more professional approach to self-publishing it warrants their attention versus, say, a do-it-yourself through Ingram or through CreateSpace.
Which to be fair, like I said, as a proviso at the start of this, not all self-publishing service companies, are equal and built the same. And equally that goes for printers, and equally not all authors can fully take on what's required to fully manage a book project and all the aspects. They are essentially the publisher managing that project.
Absolutely.
And moving forward and understanding all the, so it's understandable. So it's fine for whether you go to directly with Lightning Stores, who kind of were the original of what ultimately shifted over and became Ingram Spark as a dedicated small press function for small publishers, for self-published authors. But not every author I always believe brings their own set of tools and knowledge to a project. It might be that they worked in marketing or PR themselves, they can best handle that side or appreciate it more. They may have come from the print or design industry themselves, or they may just simply be an author who likes to write but really isn't quite sure beyond that of the design, preparing a book file. And that's why it's so important that you work with professionals, whether it's an editor, a book designer, formatters, so it's great that we have all those sort of services out there, but I still think there's a huge importance for what I suppose broadly we would call one-stop shop publishing shops, where you can get as many services as you need under the one roof. If you don't need that, that's fine, but what you require is there in one place, rather than if you work with Ingram, or if you work directly with, let's say you're just publishing an ebook, Sure, you can go to Amazon, you can go to Smashwords, you can go to Kobo, but you're dealing with a huge amount of platforms, accounts, you're managing everything, and there's something to be said for the one-stop shop approach.
Yeah, I would agree. I think when we take on a project from a publishing through distribution, the ability to manage that all under one roof, one stage influences the next, meaning our publishing team can begin to start talking about the print aspects of the project as early as is desired by the author in terms of what type of materials, what format size, and really be the coordinator and the partner for the author in that case. And then, of course, probably the most, I struggle to say the most important, but distribution. Obviously, you can write a fantastic book. It can look beautifully printed, but if you can't get it efficiently distributed,
yeah,
and without question, that last mile, if you will, of getting the book from the printing company to the distributor at the time at which the book needs to release, that's always that last sprint that often, if you're working with different partners, you can miss that window. And then, of course, if you miss that window with Amazon or any number of distributors, you may not get back into that window for some time. So having that all under one roof can be very, very convenient. But I absolutely agree with your point, Mick. The great thing I think about where the industry is right now from a self-publishing indie standpoint is there's this tremendous range of option for the author from the Create Space and Ingram offerings all the way up to kind of that one-stop shop, which we're offering as our others.
We know obviously that the industry of independent publishing, historically vanity publishing, has its darker aspects. I suppose like any industry, there are good guys, bad guys, so-so guys. Let's move a little bit towards our case study that recently was in the news. As a preamble to that, the idea of vanity presses and the darker side of publishing, you and I have been in this a long time. You probably a lot longer than I have, and there are bad stories out there that give authors a bad perception of self-publishing. Some of it entirely understandable, and some of it utterly unforgivable, that give you guys and what you're trying to do a bad name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree, and I wish that it wasn't as prolific as it is in the industry. But there are organizations that maybe they don't intend to lead people down a dark path, but for whatever reason, they end up doing that, and it's sad to see so many authors that pour years of time and passion and emotion into writing manuscript, and then to a certain extent, right now, if an author is not finding resources like Independent Publishing Magazine to vet, then they're going with maybe a friend of a friend who happens to know a publisher, and the next thing you know, they're handing over $3,500 and hoping that this person is legitimate. And everyone who's written a book knows that that's a very emotional process when you give that manuscript over, and you're expecting a certain process in terms of design and editorial, and that starts to happen. And I've spoken to so many authors now where they have kind of the same story, where initially there are designs that are discussed, maybe even some comps that are sent over, and then it's supposed to go into the editorial phase, and sure enough, things start taking longer, and people no longer are answering the phone, and then it goes to email, and then months later the website is offline.
It suddenly goes offline, and suddenly it's like we're gone. Good luck. I suppose.
And then sadly, many of these authors have signed contracts that have signed away their rights to their content. So that the irony is now they can't get their legal rights back to publish that book elsewhere. It's a real slippery slope, and
it's one of the biggest questions as a publishing consultant I get is, okay, look, I maybe didn't research this enough as I should. I made some mistakes. Okay, that's fine. We all make mistakes, but they're faced in a situation with, as we'll talk about with our case study, is how the hell do I extract myself from this mess that occurred? Talk to us a little bit about Tanya, isn't it? Tanya Bell.
Yes, Tanya Bell.
Talk to us a little bit about how that came out. That's got quite a bit of coverage in the United States. Perhaps not quite as much worldwide, but certainly within the United States. Tell us how that all came about.
So it's not dissimilar to the story I outlined. Tanya had written a book, kind of a memoir to her husband who had passed.
A sort of a love story of a husband who passed away. Yeah,
that's right. And it was part of the grieving process for her to write this book, and obviously put her soul into it, and spent a lot of time preparing that manuscript, researched her publisher, decided to go with a publisher, signed an agreement, and sadly that's just what happened is things started taking longer to get done. She was promised any number of revisions of designs and editorial, and sadly Tanya ended up spending about a year and a half in that process of thinking that her book was getting published, when in fact I suspect very little was being done, until she just couldn't get anyone on the phone anymore, and that company, Green Ivy, is no longer in business. And actually we found out through our media here in the States what had happened to Tanya, and we reached out to her and said that we could help and we'd be happy to help. And the interesting after fact is that we were introduced to a group on Facebook that has a page of all of these authors from that publisher who are in similar situation. Many of them can't get their books back. Many of them don't have final manuscript. The real tragedy is that some of these books are online and still being sold, and money is being collected, and they're not seeing any of it.
And it's not funneled back to the author.
It's not funneling back to the author, and in some cases, it's a significant amount of money. It's a real tragedy in the making, and I wish I could say that was an isolated incident, but it's not, and that really points to the pitfall for an author when you're starting is how do you find the right partner? How do you cut through the clutter of Google to find somebody who you can trust and who's actually going to take care of it? Yeah, that's
isn't
right.
always quite your best friend.
That's right. It can be a very daunting task, and I think authors who have finished their manuscript or think they've finished their manuscript, they want to get that into the next stage as quickly as possible. And really, I guess that's when you have to take pause, do your research, find organizations that can help you, find the right partners for what you're looking to do. It takes time. And sadly, there are a lot of people out there that are not doing their best to advance that part of the industry.
Let's move on to some of the future developments at Thomson-Shore. So kind of like where you are now. We've talked an awful lot about the history of the company, where you are now, and maybe where you're moving towards. But in particular, I want you to talk a little bit about this book Oktoberfest And I suppose this touches as well on the whole idea of what we talked about transparency and open days. But talk to me a little bit about Book Oktoberfest and what that's about for
Sure.
authors and for Thomson-Shore.
Mhm. We we recognize the author community is massive. It's growing. The future, very viable, very large portion of the publishing industry will be and will continue to grow in the indie methods, self-publishing methods. So we believe, although we do a tremendous amount of business with large publishers, we believe that the author direct to reader workflow will continue to grow. So we're looking for ways to engage that community directly, educate them as to what's available in terms of a higher quality product, both in terms of content development and printing and distribution. So we thought about having an event where we celebrated the author and we celebrated books. And so in late October, we're having the Booktoberfest event here at our facility, in which we're inviting publishing professionals from around the states, authors. We've got people from as high as Random House all the way down to very successful self-publishers coming to speak and talk to authors about the process, talk to authors about what they should research, pitfalls, areas they've stumbled, areas they've had success. And so we're taking the day having those discussions, and we're also offering authors a chance to pitch to a panel of publishing professionals, in which we will pick a title to publish for that author in a manner that would not require them to pay upfront fees on the publishing side. So that'll be a pitch opportunity for authors with publishing professionals. And then, of course, we've got a 200,000 square foot facility that will be giving tours and talking about how books are made. And then we've got some fun things like beer and brats and yoga and all kinds of fun things.
I suppose to reflect, and one thing I've always felt is, maybe less so now than it was maybe 5 years ago, the traditional established end of the publishing industry has slowly but surely, and when I say the traditional end, I'm not just talking about publishers, I'm also talking about, marketers, literary agents, as well as publishers. But there's much more of an embrace of the whole self-publishing community happening now that wasn't happening before. Although, having said that, I would qualify it to say that some of the larger trade fairs, Book Expo, you're probably more familiar with the London Book Fair, Frankfurt, for a time where embracing an awful lot of that, where there was whole sections within those fairs to encompass the self-publishing community. I don't know what your feelings are, and this is just a general, I'm throwing this out. Have you felt that maybe that's slipped a little bit recently, in a way that it was much more a functional part? I felt that at the London Book Fair, and I actually stopped going 2 or 3 years ago because I went there as a publishing consultant, but broadly because so many of my clients were self-published authors. But I felt that it slipped away a little bit more, and at those fairs, and I respect that they are ultimately trade organized for the trade, for booksellers, for publishers. But I just felt that maybe there's been a little bit of a slip in the last year or two, slightly more, maybe longer, that it's been pushed a little bit back out into the fringe, in a sense that we made some gains in the last 5 or 10 years, but there's a little bit of a push back, and you get this mantra from publishers as well, and organizations that reflect the publishing trade that, oh, well, look, you know, that whole ebook thing, you know, it's not quite what it used to be, and, you know, and we're back to, I feel, the mantra of print, 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 you know.
Mm-hmm. I certainly agree that the ebook rush to the utopian environment is definitely in the last few years subsided significantly, and we have seen a return of traditional publishers to print. No question about it.
Yeah.
What I've been excited about is that there seems to be now more than ever, but it's been growing, emphasis on the cover of a book. If it's a case-bound book, the embellishments, using more foil stamping and embossing, and even on softcover books, the same. Whether it be spot varnish applications or UV coating. So that I would agree with you. There's been a return to print is where the majority of sales are coming from. Let's focus on print. Ebooks have kind of found its place, kind of like audio. It's in that 20-25% range of leadership, and it's going to stay there. And
for
let's get
so
back
long
to,
in the industry, we had, you know, talk about, you know, ebooks would eventually be 50% or potentially more. And I think a lot of us had some reservations that quite, you know, ebooks were going to get to that level. And it does seem to have settled at around the 20 to 25% of the market.
Yeah, and the publishers I talk to seem to be pretty content with that. I don't hear, I travel all over the States and in the UK, and I don't hear a lot of publishers trying to go out of their way to figure out how to grow ebook. It's just kind of there. It's at that mark. They're going to continue to support it, but there certainly is a return to let's get serious about our print books and how we're producing them. In terms of the self-publishing label, I think that it's certainly more widely accepted today as not only viable but a in some cases preferred route for authors. The number I keep hearing, just as an aside, the number of books accepted by agents or publishers through agents or directly, number of manuscripts accepted is still only about 5%, no more than 10%. There's a lot of books that are available for publication that publishers and agents just aren't going to take. 90% in that regard. So you can't deny that self-publishing, that's a wonderful route to get these books into the marketplace. I think where I'm trying to envision the next, how does self-publishing go to the next level, and that's when I think that will happen when books become more professional, when authors are thinking harder about how their marketing plan is going to influence sales, and when self-published books go from selling hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, that's when the industry at whole is going to have to accept that it's not just a small segment.
It's not an aberration.
Yeah, and we see that now with some of the books that we self-publish are fortunate enough to sell in the thousands, in some cases tens of thousands, and now retailers have to take notice because that's demand, and retailers and distributors and wholesalers want to be able to feed that demand. So, with the success of self-published books in the marketplace, it will force the industry to take it very seriously, and I have no doubt that that's just going to happen in the ongoing evolution of self-publishing. We're now talking to more and more professional authors, and what we haven't talked a lot about is that the role of the author's platform in marketing and selling books. And I'm talking to authors now that have 25 to 50,000. Some, when you pull into Instagram, some have upwards to 100,000 followers. That is a tremendous resource to tap into to sell books. So I think as those professional authors figure out and become more sophisticated about how to market and get their books to their platform, these books are going to sell 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 copies more regularly. And when that happens, the industry is going to have to take the self-publishing segment very, very seriously in all regards, whether that be trade shows or terms that are set up for authors specifically to go direct to readers. Bookstores, I think right now, are really missing an opportunity. Independent bookstores, certainly in the States, still do not see self-published books as something they want to be a big part of. But I think they have to figure out that the independent bookstores across the states and the globe should be thinking about how do we embrace this author-to-reader workflow and become a part of it rather than ignore it. Some of that has to do with the quality of the content or the way the book looks. But as that matures, I think the independent book to get in line with the indie author.
And I think we've seen some great developments that kind of answer one of the problems for booksellers. Obviously, I know a lot of independent booksellers are open to, hosting, evenings where, you have self-published authors there, signing and selling books, and an awful lot more independent publishers are becoming more open to that and going, oh, wow, we can actually sell some books here and stock some books. I suppose one of the other aspects of that, although it's never quite taken off in the way I think it was expected, was the espresso book machines. I know the American bookstore they have a couple of stores, one in Amsterdam and one in The Hague. And they've, again, been over the last, nearly 10 years now, been developing, workshops and evenings where self-publishers are introduced to this aspect, where, look, if we can't, stock 10 or 20 copies of your book, here's one way where a customer can come in and instead of being told, well, we don't actually stock that book or it's not available if it's a self-published title, but do you know what, if it's on the Ingram system, we've got a machine here, if you hang on 10 minutes, we can run off a copy for you. I don't think that aspect has quite taken on in the way that the company that had the rights to the espresso book machine wanted it to. I know there was an awful lot of link-ups with, I think, Kodak for a while, where you went in and just like you brought in your stick with pictures on it and you produced, but and there's a burgeoning market for that kind of thing, particularly for photographers. I know this has been the background for companies like Blurb, who've really built their business when it started out on photographers and artists wanting to have books. We now see so many advertisements now on TV for services like that. So talk to me a little bit about, because there's also other aspects for the book industry and the way it works for visual arts, and we've talked we haven't talked too much about enhanced ebooks and interactive ebooks as well, and how that maybe again hasn't quite taken off, because that's a huge thing so talk to me a little bit maybe around that area of some of those aspects.
I think the espresso machine it held great conceptual promise, and there were a number of them that were placed in independent bookstores here in the States, as well as a lot of universities in their libraries.
Universities at the start,
So it held a lot of promise. I think at this point it's not getting a lot of attention, that workflow, and I think there there are two reasons that I would identify. One is that frankly the books just didn't look very good, and when you try and put a print shop and a binding shop in a box in an independent bookstore and expect that to work consistently, silly things like if the machine had been turned off all day, in order to get that book, you've got to turn it on. You got to heat glue up and run some test books.
As much as I know, the American Bookstore have dedicated people there, and and that was, I think, one other resource that I heard a number of independent books. I think the old Blackwell stores as well. I think in London also tried to take this on, and the problem was, I said, look, part of the problem, the reason why some of these independent bookstores ultimately said, we'll give it a year, no, this isn't working, is because they felt they had to have a dedicated person at any time there and fully, up to speed on how this machine worked. If something got jammed, if something, they almost had to have an operative permanently there, and it just didn't pay them, because you couldn't ask a customer to walk in and press a few buttons. This wasn't like working your print scanner at home. This was quite a substantial size machine that would have terrified a customer to be pointed where you want your book. Yeah, go over to that machine and press a few buttons. And I think that was also a part of the interactive. That you needed an operative and a small independent bookstore who took on the expense or the leasing of a machine like that. It just wasn't a workable thing. I think maybe in like an institute or university or an academy, I think it might work, but I think that's one of the fundamental problems I think independent bookstores had with it.
No question. And I've heard that when I've had the opportunity to chat with some of the bookstores that had the espresso machine in place, it just became more work than they expected it to be.
Turned around, yeah,
and it just wasn't worth it at the end of the day. So I'm not sure that's getting much interest at all, frankly, right now. But and then the secondary issue is, it's incredible that today you hit that buy me button from Amazon and get a book in a day. So that immediate gratification that was promised with the espresso machine is less of a concern when the supply chain, whether it be from Ingram to a bookstore or Amazon to a reader location, if you can get that in a day, that's not that much longer than the few hours that maybe you'd get it from the espresso machine, and you're going to get a full-on book that looks and smells and feels like a real book. So for those two reasons, I think the espresso machine just maybe was ahead of its time, perhaps, and just never really took off. Same with the enhanced ebooks. There was so much promise in regards to creating this environment of ebooks for readers to go beyond the words and experience the story in a three-dimensional method, but it almost got to the point where it wasn't a book anymore. It was beginning to become a CD-ROM on a
I think
platform.
The problem is that any publisher or author, as much as they want their platform and channels built into that ebook, well, here's my website, here's my social media channels, but you can check out more about them. I think the thing with enhanced ebooks is you can overdo it with so much enhancements that at every couple of pages, so to speak, in metaphorical terms, you're taking the reader away you're directing the reader constantly away to other channels. And I suppose it's like all forms of marketing, whether it's a website, a book, or whatever, you want that captured audience. You don't want to keep directing them away to different places.
Yeah, and I think today, I believe more than ever, with as much technology and media is in everybody's face all day, when somebody picks up a book, to a certain extent, it's a bit of an escape, and they just want to focus on that story. And the last thing I would want as a reader is a pop-up that's showing me the map of the book that I'm reading. I want that to happen in my mind's eye. And I do think that people still are, and I think more so now, using that paper book, that physical book, as their escape from some of modern day's influences, and it's across generations.
So I suppose as we finalize, should we be afraid or embrace technology for its good and its bad at times? We're all scared of those stories about, factory lines that are being replaced with robotic machinery, and I suppose we still think about it, much in the same way.
Yeah, that's certainly a question that I know we'll be pondering for many years. And you see every day media influencers predicting the future of AI and taking over our world. On the one aspect, I think you have to believe no, that's not possible, and then the other aspect, you can see exactly how it would be possible. I think as it relates to what we do, which is creating stories and putting it in a vehicle to get to other people to consume and have dialogue about. I think technology has been has really created a new world for storytelling and an opportunity for authors and everyone, it's cliche, but everyone has a book, whether that's a photography book that they want to publish or a memoir or an academic product. Everyone has a book, and now technology has made it available for those authors to get that book out into the world for people to consume, whether people want it or not. The technology is there for them to do that, and I think that's really powerful. So at the moment, I'm still embracing it.
Yeah, good. That's good. I suppose let's finish up on an anecdote or a story. I'm always intrigued because when I talk to people in this industry, the service industry, they'll always talk to me about the authors who the authors who ask the most craziest things. Have you ever had experiences like that? When an author and you went,
sure.
What?
It's funny because authors they're passionate, they're emotional, they're demanding, and I think that's what's great about authors, working directly with authors. I love that passion that authors have, and to a certain extent, I like to put us in the position of trying to take their passion and see their vision and bring it together for the form of a book. We just had an author come in just a week or so ago, who she's written a book, and every 16 pages or so, the paper changes color to take on the mood of the story through. Yeah. And then at the end, ultimately, the pages are transparent. And this is really important to her. So figuring out how we're going to be able to, in somewhat of mass production, print on all of these different colors of paper, and then ultimately transparency paper, and get that bound into a book that is strong and is going to withstand readings from multiple people. It's going to be a challenge, but that's what we love to do. At the end of the day, I think anyone can print a standard. Something like that's a real challenge. It's satisfying to see it all come together.
On that note, Kevin Spall, President and CEO of Thomson-Shore, thank you for joining us at Radio Espial today.
Thank you, Mick. I really enjoyed it. It's a pleasure to be here.
No problem. Kevin, you take care, and we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks to Kevin for joining us today from Thomson-Shore. Plenty more episodes to come up before the end of the year. Okay, thanks to Kevin for joining us today from Thomson-Shore. Plenty more episodes to come up before the end of the year. Just a reminder, as always, you can find us at www.radioespial.com. We're on Facebook and we're on Twitter. If you just bang in Radio Espial, all our episodes are broadcast in podcast and videocast. We're available on iTunes, YouTube, Spreaker, SoundCloud, various other channels. You can get all the links wherever you see this podcast below. Thanks again. We've plenty more episodes coming up for you before the end of the year. I am going to get back to Malaysia Airlines MH370. I'm hoping to have a guest lined up, and we'll talk about that. There are some developing episodes on that in recent days here in October. Again, talk to you very soon. God bless.
Been listening to Radio Espial, a series of podcasts brought to you across the internet by TIPM Media and presented by investigative journalist Mick Rooney. Please feel free to leave a comment and visit our links provided in this podcast production. Thank you for your support.